What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Between the Numbers Sports Podcast and Show. I'm your host, and we're gonna be talking about the new kings of college football. So there's some new kings. You know, the GOAT, the greatest coach of all times, Nick Saban decided to retire. Jim Harbaugh has gone to the pros. He's gonna be coaching the LA Chargers, right? And so someone has to take their place, right? And so there's two new kings, right? There's two new kings, right? And those kings are, you know, Kirby Smart and Dan Lanning, right? Kirby Smart, UGA, Dan out of Oregon, right? And those are two kings, right? Everyone else is just going to be, I would say gatekeepers, right? But everyone's going to be looking up to the kings, right? All hail the kings, and that's going to be Kirby Smart and Dan Lanning. And the reason why I'm saying that is because let's start off with Georgia, right? It's Georgia. Last year they finished 13-1. The only blemish came against Alabama in the SEC championship, right? I still think Georgia should have went to the playoffs, but hey, it is what it is. You got to win all your games and at least be a conference champ. That was Georgia's only loss last year. You can't you gotta expect Georgia to be right back in the thick of things. Because for one, they had a phenomenal year last year. They got a couple of guys returning, right? Carson Beck's returning, right? Quarterback. Last year he threw for 3,941 yards and 23 touchdowns. Sorry, 24 touchdowns, right? He's coming back. So he's gonna have another year as the starter, receiving all of the snaps in the offseason and then rolling into the season with the ones and getting back to it in a chase for another national championship, right? They also are today was National Signing Day, right? But Georgia brought in the number one recruiting class, right? The number one high school recruiting class um, as of today, and like I said, they got some guys returning on offense and on defense. They are losing some guys, right? They're losing stud wide receiver. They're losing their stud tight end, but they're bringing some guys in from high school and they're bringing some guys in from the transfer portal. And more importantly, man, they got Kirby Smart, right? Kirby Smart is a disciple of Nick Saban, right? And you got to think that Kirby Smart is already in those guys' ears and telling those guys in that Georgia program that look, we lost to Alabama last year. We should have never lost that game. That should have been us. That should have been us playing Michigan. That should have been us playing in the national championship, right? And so you already know that Nick Saban is in those guys' ears saying, look, they're already talking about how Georgia is no longer a dynasty, or Georgia couldn't handle the pressure. He's putting what I like to call a battery in those players' back, right? And he's just poking them and 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 telling them, hey, let's go. And with Nick Saban being retired, right? The SEC, you know, who's going to take his place? Someone's always going to take, someone's place. So who's going to take his place? And I think um, Kirby Smart is that guy. I mean, before last year, it seems like Georgia was already the it program in college football, but Nick Saban was still hanging around, and we saw it still in Nick Saban's I would say quote unquote old age, because you have to think that he was already kind of plotting, and he probably already had determined that after the 2023 season that he was going to retire, but he still was able to knock off the juggernauts, the defending champs, Georgia. But I think now that Nick Saban is, golfing and enjoying his retirement life, right? Life after football, I think that look to see Georgia get back on top of the college football world and stayed out for a long time. And then, you know, there's so Kings, right? If you watch a lot of shows, movies, Netflix or whatever about Kings, right? Kings are always facing off against other kings, right? They're like, oh, I'm the king of the north and I'm the king of the west or the east, right? Their forces are always colliding, right? They always want to take over, right? Two kings can't live together, right? The two kings, they're gonna want to come and fight, right? They're gonna want to battle it out so they can be the ruler of all, the ruler of all lands, right? And so you got to think that Oregon and Dan Lanning are gonna boom. They're gonna run into Georgia, right? They're gonna run into Georgia at the top. We're going to see a shitload of what I like to think national championships in the future between Georgia and Oregon, right? Dan Lanning is a Georgia guy, right? Now, all of those guys is on the same staff together with Nick Saban, right? So this is all a part of Nick Saban's coaching tree, right? Kirby was on that Georgia team and that Georgia team, assistant, or I think a grad assistant, but he was on that team. He was able to soak up some of that knowledge from the GOAT, Nick Saban, and also soak up some knowledge from Kirby Smart and some of those other coaches, right? And now he has his own team, right? He has his own team at Oregon, and Oregon is a juggernaut, man. They're a juggernaut. Now last year they lost two games, right? They lost two to a very good Washington team. Nothing wrong with that, right? They ran into Michael Penix and those wide receivers, and we seen that Michael Penix and them was able to go to the national championship versus Georgia. They didn't have the best from any game. You can hang your hat on losing to Washington. A lot of teams lost to Washington. Washington went undefeated. But uh, dominance had another crack for the national championship, right? Um, you know, they got the number four ranked high school recruiting class of 2024, right? So National Signing Day is today. Um, and they finished with the number four high school recruiting class. But they added a shitload of studs in the transfer portal, right? So they got Jabari Muhammad, cornerback from Washington. You probably heard of him before. He was the number one rated cornerback in the transfer portal. They got Evan Stewart, stud wide receiver from Texas A&M, 5 star. They got Cam Alexander, the number two rated best cornerback in the transfer portal from UTSA, Cam Alexander, 4 star, and Dante Moore, quarterback from UCLA, former 5 star, and they got Dylan Gabriel, quarterback from Ohio State. Now they got 10 transfers out of the transfer portal, right? So they took 10 players out of the transfer portal. Nine of those 10 players were starters on their previous teams, right? So you got to think, right? Dylan Gabriel Dylan Gabriel was a stud for Oklahoma. Dante Moore didn't play much for UCLA because he was behind. He was behind Dante Moore didn't play last year. Cam Alexander played. He was a stud. He was a starter for UTSA. Evan Stewart played for Texas A&M wide receiver, and Jabari Muhammad. We saw him in the national championship. We saw him versus Oregon. We saw him versus the who's of college football, lining up across from stud wide receivers, right? So the dude is a stud, right? So Oregon has reloaded with some studs, with some absolute studs, right? And you know, I wouldn't be so worried if I'm an Oregon fan that Bo Nix went to the pros because you guys are in good hands with Dylan Gabriel, and you guys also got Dante Moore in case something happens to Dylan Gabriel, God forbid. But Oregon is shaping up to be dominant once again, and they have that king, Dan Lanning, leading them, right? They got him. Georgia got Kirby Smart, and both of those programs are in really, really good hands. The rest of the who's coaches, right? You got top tier coaches, which is Kirby Smart and Dan, and then you got everybody else, right? Brian Kelly, Lincoln Riley, Ryan Day, those guys, right? Everyone else is going to be looking up at the Kings, right? All hell the king, like I say. So, I think college football is heading in a good direction. They need to get the NIL stuff straight, right? They need to get that stuff straight. They need to figure out all of the holdouts and the sit outs for the bowl games, right? Make the bowls exciting again. I used to like watching bowl games. It didn't matter if it was the Pizza Hut mayonnaise bowl, watching the bowl games, but I don't like watching the bowl games. I just watch the New Year's Six bowl games, obviously the playoff games, and whatever bowl LSU is in. But they need to figure that out. But I think there's a lot of young, young good coaches in college, and I think there's still some really older but dominant coaches, right? Like Brian Kelly's older and stuff like that. But like you still got Ryan Day, you still got Lincoln Riley, and those guys, right? And Ryan Day and Lincoln Riley are they're not old men. They're probably in their 40s or late 30s, but they're there's some up and coming younger guys, right? And then you got your kings and Dan Lanning and Kirby Smart. And I'm pretty sure Kirby Smart is an older guy, also not much older, but I'm you know what I mean. I just think college football heading in the right direction. There's a lot of good coaches, but you got the greats, right? And um, I wouldn't necessarily um, crown Dan Lanning as a great coach yet because he has to win a national championship. But Kirby Smart is a great head coach. But I think Dan Lanning is just right. So this is Kirby, and I think Dan is just like right here, right? So you got Patrick Mahomes, you got everybody else in the NFL when we're talking about quarterbacks, but you got the King and you got King A or King One dogs now in college football. I think everyone else is going to have to beat them, give them their best shot to conquer the Mount Rushmore of college football, and are what I like to call become the new king of college football. Um, so um, if you like the video, leave me a comment, leave me a like, consider subscribing to the channel. I appreciate everyone who has already subscribed to the channel, who's left a comment, who's left a like. I appreciate everyone sticking with 50 subscribers. We're on the road to 500. I got to get a little bit more active on making these videos. Life has just been kind of crazy with work and everything else, but I got to get a little bit more active in making these videos. But yeah, leave a like, leave a comment, and go back and consider watching my previous video where I talk about how Jim Harbaugh completely dominated Ryan Day so bad that Ryan Day had to spend over $10 million to get a bunch of transfers in and shit to try to beat Jim Harbaugh, but then Jim Harbaugh goes to the pros, so it was all for naught, I guess not. But yeah, go back and look at that video. I'm gonna leave a card up here, and you guys can go back and look at that video. But until next time, I'm out.